So my recent video discussing some old sci-fi shows went down very well, and the comments were really fantastic, with people reminiscing about old series they enjoyed from the 1980s and 1990s and beginning of the 2000s as well. And some of you asked me for my reactions to other series, my thoughts on other shows that you like, and I think you wanted me to expand on this a little bit. So today we're going to discuss a few different series, mostly from the 90s and early 2000s. Now, some of you asked me about my thoughts on The X-Files. The show began in 1993, and I have to confess, I was 10 at the time, and I actually wasn't allowed to watch it. It was considered a bit too scary for me. Aww. But I did watch the show later, several years later, from about season 6 onwards. I really got into The X-Files after the first film, which was in 1998, which I still maintain is a brilliant science fiction conspiracy movie by itself. It works very well without having to actually watch any of the series. Now, I've talked about that movie before, but the dynamic between Mulder and Scully throughout the TV series, the atmosphere of the show, the mix of the UFO overarching conspiracy story arc, mixed with the Twilight Zone type Outer Limits feel of some of the standalone episodes, I think that was really the show's strength. Of course, along with having two incredible leads. The show was never really the same after David Duchovny left, but season 8 I think was creatively still very strong. Robert Patrick was brilliant as John Doggett, and a really fantastic foil for Gillian Anderson's Dana Scully. But the series did go on too long. Season 9 was poor. At that point, Gillian Anderson had also reduced her role a little bit. Annabeth Gish came in to sort of fill her role as Monica Reyes. They did a second movie several years later, which I think was terrible. It was a real low-budget, standalone, low-stakes kind of monster of the week story, which just wasn't strong enough to serve as a feature film. And I just remember there was this whole story about cutting people's heads off and putting them on other people's bodies. It was just really stupid. Of course, they brought the show back in recent years, but the magic and the energy is just not there anymore. So I was also asked about Babylon 5. This comes up a lot. I generally liked the show. I've always found the characters far more complex and real when compared to Star Trek characters. The writing of the dialogue in Babylon 5, it's far more contemporary. It was a much deeper show with a strong mystical and spiritual component to it. Its primary war with the Shadows dealt with the themes of good and evil from a very biblical religious allegory. I do find it hard to look back now and not see how much Deep Space Nine ripped off Babylon 5. I have previously talked about this in a video at length with various comparisons, which are quite striking. It's hard to deny, given that the series Bible from J. Michael Straczynski, creator of Babylon 5, had been floating around and clearly served as a major influence for DS9. Babylon 5 really doesn't get its due, I think. It starts out a little bit slow, but it's very rewarding to watch the whole series develop. Absolutely the height of the series, the best of both worlds type heart and mouth moment, was the third season finale in which Sheridan goes to Zahadum, where all the Shadows are, and his wife has been taken over by one of them, and it's really creepy, the scene where she's trying to convince him to come back, and he's standing over this abyss beneath him. He directs the White Star full of nukes to crash down into his location, and he jumps because he hears the voice of Kosh telling him to jump. It's an unreal finale. But I will say as well, the late Michael O'Hare was brilliant as Sinclair, but he left the show after the first season because of personal health reasons. But he did briefly come back later on. But Bruce Boxleitner was just awesome as Sheridan, a great leading man for this series. But generally speaking, the cast across the board was really strong. It was a very elaborate universe and very complex and multi-layered. Every character got significant development. The show had an epicness about it, and some fantastic space battles as well. Now, the show decided to go with CGI models in the early 1990s, which CG still wasn't developed enough to really compete with physical models, which Star Trek was using mostly at the time. But it certainly gave the show a unique visual look, but by today's standards, the CG looks a bit video gamey. It hasn't held up very well. I don't think the effects spoil the enjoyment of the series or anything, but it could be improved upon now if they chose to remaster the CG in a future release of the series. Now, I want to give you another blast from the past. SeaQuest DSV. Now, this was mentioned by a lot of people in the previous video. I really liked the show. I especially liked the show in its first 2 seasons, especially the first season. It was basically Star Trek The Next Generation, but underwater, starring the phenomenal Roy Scheider as Captain Nathan Bridger. The late Jonathan Brandis was also on the show, and he played a young man named Lucas, who developed this device that allowed the dolphin on the show to talk. Yes, the show had a talking dolphin named Darwin. Stephanie Beecham was on the show as well, and she was the doctor. So there was sort of a Picard, Beverly Crusher kind of relationship between her and Bridger's character. It was based in the year 2018 on a spaceship, a deep submergence vehicle called SeaQuest, DSV 4600. The federation of the show was the United Earth Oceans Organization, the UEO, and they were tasked with protecting the underwater colonies of the future from pirates and unaligned nations and organizations who would try to exploit them. Because humanity had exhausted the planet's natural resources, lots of people moved underwater in these underwater cities. But the show had some sci-fi elements in there as well, which increased significantly in the second season to the point where it was just trying too hard to be an underwater version of Star Trek. And this was much to the show's detriment, actually, because SeaQuest really worked fairly well when it was trying to be true to itself, true to its original core premise. But in Season 2, they moved production to Florida, and several cast members left, and the show just changed in the writing, becoming less believable. The show felt like a spiritual successor to Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, but it had started out cerebral and intelligent enough with some grounded political stories, and gradually it fell into silly off-the-wall cliched science fiction tropes, many of which had been done better on other series. The series also had this little segment at the end of each episode about some important environmental message. Looking back at it now, it kind of seems odd. The season finale of Season 2 was very strong, bringing in aliens and ending on a major cliffhanger, which saw several characters not return for the third season, and Roy Scheider would become a semi-regular for Season 3. The show was completely retooled in Season 3. They changed the name of the show to SeaQuest 2032, and they brought in Michael Ironside to replace Roy Scheider. He played Captain Oliver Hudson. He was a no-nonsense, tough-as-nails leader, and probably what the show needed at that point, though personally I had kind of checked out. I preferred Nathan Bridger and Roy Scheider, and I didn't like the fact that the cast had changed so much so quickly. This changed the configuration of the show. Of course, throughout the life of a TV series, there will be cast turnover here and there, but you still need continuity in your cast. There was simply too many people coming and going on SeaQuest, and the show especially struggled when it lost its main star. Now, Michael Ironside is awesome, of course, but it was too little too late for SeaQuest at that stage. The show was cancelled after the 13th episode of its third season. By the way, William Shatner even appeared on the show as a bad guy. SeaQuest is a classic show now, no doubt about it, and I think generally speaking people look back at the show with a great deal of fondness, but it never really lived up to its potential after its first season. Now I'm going to move on now to talk about a show that most people, especially in America, will never have heard of. It's a BBC show called Crime Traveller. It starred Chloe Annette and Michael French. It had one season of 8 episodes airing in 1997. It was a detective show with time travel, as the name suggests. It was about 2 detectives, Slade and a science officer, Turner, who use a time machine to solve crimes. The time machine was built by Turner's father. It was a simple formula, but an excellent execution, because time travel as a concept is very easy to get wrong. And it was actually very intelligently used in this show. I think the man-woman detective duo dynamic in a sci-fi show was still fairly fresh and new at the time, and so the relationship between the 2 main characters had a kind of Mulder and Scully vibe about it. Crime Traveller is a short series, like I say, just 8 episodes. but I think it's really worth your time if you've never seen this show, and if you haven't watched it in a while, check it out. Now, for those people wondering, I've already made videos on this channel about Stargate SG-1, Stargate Atlantis, and Stargate Universe. I've done individual videos about each of those shows, so you can find those on the channel, and you'll know that I'm a fan of all three of them. So I don't want to go over them again, but I'm going to talk about another series that I think many people have forgotten about as well, and this one is from 2003. This is the final series I'm going to talk about in this video. It's called True Calling. Now, this is another show about solving crime, especially murders, using time travel. The main character is named True Davies, played by Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel's Eliza Dushku. She works in a morgue, and dead people sometimes speak to her. They say, "Save me," and then she time travels back to before they died and has to try to stop them from dying. She's helped by her boss, Davis, who's played by Zach Galifianakis. This was before the Hangover movies. As a mostly standalone series, the show worked really well. But then later in the first season, a new character was introduced, played by Jason Priestley, and he can also travel through time. But he becomes a villain, and he's actually brilliant in the role and genuinely very creepy and sinister. After he's introduced, the show develops a real sense of urgency and a very strong direction. There's backstory concerning True's father, who's the main antagonist in the show, and that was just starting to take off and become interesting before the show was cancelled after the 6th episode of the 2nd season. The primary story and all the other mysteries were left unresolved, unfortunately, and it really was a shame. The show didn't get the level of appreciation it deserved, and like many short-lived sci-fi series, it needed more time. Some shows make a big positive impact quickly, and they stay on the air long enough to garner a decent audience and high ratings. Other shows are a slower burn. True Calling didn't make enough of an impact to justify continuing, but it's still worth watching, and the first season offers a satisfying first chapter at least. So that's going to do it for this video and this trip down memory lane. Let me know what you think of these 6 shows that I've talked about today. I might do more retrospectives in the future if you're interested. And I also intend to do a video on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, but that's going to be an exclusive video for this month over on Subscribestar. So if you'd like to see my premium content on Subscribestar, you can get access to that for as little as $1 per month. The link to my Subscribestar is below. It's very much appreciated and it helps to keep the channel going, and you'll also get additional content. Thank you very much for watching. Looking forward to your comments below. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.